Yeah, so hello, today we are continuing. Wait a second. Hello, today we are continuing our examination of authority. We are going into the historical analysis about certain historical manifestations which kind of give us additional context, they give us additional information about the progress of authority as a concept, as how it progressed through the ages, some certain developments which I would consider it to be very important in that development. Today we are starting our journey, a 3 or 4 video long journey about Greece. This is not to say that any of this is the origin. It's just an important point I think that we can look at and examine and potentially learn something from about authority. So we're going to be starting with Greece. And our videos are going to be three different videos, I suppose. The first one is the one we're doing now, and that is democracy. Democracy, right? It is, in my opinion, too ambitious to say that democracy originated in ancient Athens or anywhere else in the Western world. I don't think that democracy as a term can have a traced origin, but regardless, this is something which is widely considered as the birthplace of democracy. I would say that there is quite a bit of Western ideology in that manifestation, but whatever. Let's move on. The second point is trial of Socrates. This is, I would say, one of the more important events in the history of authority. It kind of qualifies the collective in a sense. Well, you know, when we speak about collective, we speak about the mass, the mob, the whatever, the body of rule. And it kind of humanizes it. And this humanization, as we'll see later on, is going to be very crucial in the progress of authority. And the third is one of my, I would say my own, but it isn't. It's just something which I call like this, and this is the origin of anti-authority. Anti-authority, and we're going to be looking at 2 or 3 people here, depending on how I feel that day. But one is pretty obvious, the other one isn't, and I'll let you simmer on that one. So the first thing we need to qualify is on this question here, which is what we are studying today, the trial of Socrates, and anti-authority is something which we're going to be going into the other day. So in democracy, we actually are interested in 2 specific questions. One is collective, the other is mechanism. So when we're talking about the collective, we're talking about the body which is relevant to our inquiry, right? When we're talking about America, on the elections for the President of the United States, we're talking about the relevant body of the United States citizenry. So who counts as a part of the collective is already a question, is the question of the collective, right? Who gets to vote, essentially, and how that vote actually qualifies itself in the sense of, okay, even if someone is a citizen but has practical limitations on the accessibility of voting, does he count as a citizen or not? Is it the duty of the state to provide the practicality for it? That is the question of who counts. And this is a very tense question. As you can imagine, already me asking that question gives you some ideas in the today and not too long past in history about people not. One of the more interesting questions, which might not be already apparent, is that nation itself is the limitation of here. So we are already saying, and it is barely, I have barely read any justification for this about other than like hyper-nationalists who qualify, why is it that United States people are the only people relevant for the choices United States makes? That's a fucking interesting question, but that is a question for a long into the future. We are going to be talking about democracy in much more direct way, because that is where the theory of democracy is going to be in its most fullest, at least as the study goes. Mechanism is actually the question about how do we determine the will of the mob, right? Essentially, when we're talking about if we have 100 people and 49 of them say no and 51 says yes, is it sufficient, or is it okay for us to say that we say yes here, so that the will of the collective is yes because 51 people said yes, or maybe 100 people need to say yes and no one can say no for this to be sufficient, or maybe 1 and 99. This is a question of the mechanism. How do we qualify the will? The other question of the mechanism is the limitations of choices that the citizenry has the privilege to. Some questions aren't questions that people can have privy to. That is why you have representative democracies. That's why you have within commonly known democracies, you have limitations on bodies such as Supreme Court, that you don't vote anything on it, right? It's just there. They are essentially they are elected by the people you elect, but they can't be deselected by the people you elect unless another people you didn't elect that this it's a complete fucking process of fucking nonsense that happens. Like this whole process is about the mechanisms are about that question, right? What, how, when, whatever is privy to us as citizens, or not privy to us as citizens. Maybe like in representative democracies, we elect people, but we don't elect the choices they make. We kind of just assume that because we elected the people, we have to agree essentially to the choices they make. That's kind of nonsense if you ask me, but we kind of agree to it. There are arguments for this, like from necessity or whatever, but those are again far into the future of our inquiry. Here we're going to be talking about a couple of points. I don't know, probably four. The first is Solon, the sea guy. I don't know how to spell it. It's Clantians or whatever, but I just call him the sea guy. The third one is, yeah, I had three. I don't have to create more chapters. It's just going to be cluttered. And the discontents, like the discontent. The last part is just a sort of thing that I need to mention because it's often neglected. The Solon, the sea guy is often thought about as the father of democracy. I think that's kind of nonsense, but whatever. And the sea guy has the foundation of democracy is actually in Solon, at least that is the reading, but you can find histories of influence all the way back in history as much as you want to go. That's kind of the point of the history. You can't really just reduce it as I'm doing now, but whatever, right? I think this is just a couple of things I think are most necessary for our understanding here. Solon's reforms, sea guy reforms, and the discontents. Okay, so this is what we did here. Solon, and the discontents. So we are now going into talking about Solon. This is not going to take long. Solon actually has quite a few interesting things that he did, and the most relevant thing to understand is that Solon came to power. He was an aristocrat during a very turbulent time in ancient Greece. The aristocracy got bold, very bold, and riots and whatever happened, tensions between Athens and its neighbors, even within itself, the outside itself, were kind of bad. And Athens was lacking in trade and power and so many things. But most importantly, I think for Solon, the citizenry was in upset. It was disconnected from anything real. So he did a couple of things. I'll note them in no particular order, but I'll note them kind of with notations 1, 2, 3, right? And that is the abolition of debt. Abolition of debt. This is quite interesting because today this idea is so radical that thinking of it would get many people very, very upset. But what he did is that he found that debt slavery was running rampant. So rampant that the workforces and aristocracy and everything was kind of in disbalance. And that led to tensions. It's quite a famous thing in sociology that when inequality rises, discontent rises, and riots and whatever. So this is the problem that he had. Another interpretation is why he did this is that aristocracy isn't like cured of going into debt, and they could fall into debt slavery themselves. So it could be that some people that he cared about got into this trouble and he couldn't find a smarter way to solve it. Like we can't really know why he did this, apart from the obvious, I guess, to kind of stop the rampant turning of Greek citizens into slaves. So this is, of course, we need to know that he didn't abolish debt as an institution, right? You could still go into debt. What he abolished is existing debt. Like if you had like student loans, essentially he canceled them. That's literally what he did. It's funny that I was reading that there is no like precedent in whatever in any democracy of canceling student debt, and then you go into the creation of democracies and look at this. Quite funny. Well, whatever, right? He canceled all debt for citizens, of course, right? Who cares about slaves and women? Sarcasm, obviously. And he canceled the institution of debt slavery, right? You couldn't be turned into a slave by virtue of debt. That's kind of all he did, right? And connected to this, the second point is that he turned politics from aristocracy to money. This doesn't seem like a big thing, right? In kind of, it's vague, because we don't really know what this meant. Like he created some laws which limited aristocratic power and rose the power of the moneyed class, but it's very unsated. But what is important is that there was a sort of cultural shift, that heredity wasn't that important anymore, right? You know, when we think about aristocrats, we think about hereditary sort of power. You're in power because of you being born from a certain parent. The moneyed class is self-explanatory almost. They are they are self-explanatory. You don't really need me to explain what moneyed class is. The reason he did this is, again, you can't really as a citizen access this, right? This is like a holy ground. You as a pleb, essentially a nobody, can't do shit to get access to this class. So it's kind of there, you impregnable, it's whatever. But theoretically, at least the myth goes that you can access this, right? So this shift was a sort of motivation which we can consider is that it is another attempt similar to one to ease the ability of the aristocracy, their power, to kind of appease the citizenry. The third point is the creation of the Council of 500. Not 500, 400. Right? So what he did is that he created this, like when I'll not, when I'm talking about the SIGA, I'm going to be talking about citizenry. But here we just kind of vaguely know what citizen means, right? And he created the Council of 400 in which kind of quote-unquote citizens could participate in. They would radim, snimam. Snimam. Da, ne mogu se.
Dobro.
Aj, bok.
Ajde, a da nek bude tuman.
Može. Where citizens would and did kind of propose laws that the higher levels of government would decide on. And there was another judiciary body in which kind of citizens could propose laws. And these citizens were again like aristocrats. It wasn't very democratic then. And Hellenia, the judiciary was actually of citizens of the kind of lower level, but not that impressive actually. And the most important thing that he did is, I would call it, demystification of the law. Demystification of law, I guess. So he would create these wooden planks, these tablets, and he would inscribe in them the laws, right, and put them for the public to see. That seems like a very trivial thing, but that was actually the most important thing of all this. He created a sort of sense in which laws weren't something outside, right? That's something that, for example, let's Frank here. He is a citizen, and I am the big bad wolf of the government, whatever, monarchy. And I just say you broke this law, whatever, and he would just not have any access to those laws. He would come before the council, and then they would say you broke this law, and this guy would just be, what the fuck are you talking about, right? He would just go, I don't know what you're talking about. But it was kind of outside Frank's view. It was just a mystical force that bound him. It's not obviously there were previous examples of this, like Hammurabi's laws or whatever. They would on these tablets and shit. But the point of this is that they would be brought before the citizenry. They would be present and visible on the public square or whatever. And suddenly the perception of law and the government as something here, something for me, became here. It got into the minds. Maybe this mystical force of law is something I can access, asks Frank. Stupid Frank, he doesn't know shit, but maybe he thought, like Frank thought, like I could access this motherfucker. And that is actually I would say the most important precursor to the creation of democracy in ancient Greece. And now we're actually going into the so-called creation, the Sigai. I'll try to write his name now. I have my papers with me, my trusted papers on fucking names and shit. Let me check if I see guy. See guy, his name is Claytenes. Clay's fucking bitches. What the fuck is your name? Whatever. The C guy. C guy, whatever the fuck. Right? And here we have 2.5 questions we need to answer, right? The first question is the person versus the process of creation, whatever, or see, whatever the fuck. And the second is the question of what did or what was created. Okay, so now we actually need to kind of take a step back and talk about this shit. Usually, the C guy is the guy we named the father of democracy. It is no coincidence that he was a man, because, you know, patriarchy shit of the time and history of it all, but digression. The interesting thing is that in history there is this narrative often presented that it is driven by people in the sense of strong individuals. This is not true, and we need to kind of stop ourselves from thinking like this. And so now we're going to be talking about the process of creation. What happened is that there was this tension in ancient Greece, 507 and 8 around BC, between Sparta and Athens. And Sparta wanted to rule over Athens, essentially. And they were very close. It's obviously arguable what their plans were, but there was this tension, and they sent some troops there, and it's kind of inconsequential why there was this skirmish riot in Athens for our point here. You can learn about it from the sources I'll have in description. They can explain that shit more than me. I'm not really that interested in that, but there was this skirmish, right, between Sparta, and the sea guy was in quite a predicament. He needed power to resist Sparta, but he couldn't get it from the usual suspects of the aristocracy because they were kind of in the pocket of Sparta. So the next thing is that he turned his eyes down, essentially, and what he found was a long and history of sort of, I don't want to be ruled by Sparta, from Athenian citizens and people living in Athens. And now the story goes is that he used that shit to kind of his advantage to get power and whatnot. And this is when we turn, like, the process is then that the riot happened, and then we get to the creation of sea guys' laws. And this is when we are kind of going into the question of the person of this. Why and how and what was his place in this whole ordeal? There are like 3 interpretations. The cynical interpretation is that sea guy was quite a politician. He used the discontent, or the contempt for the Sparta and discontent of being occupied by of Athenian citizens and used it for his advantage. And he was crude enough that in the creation of the, he made some promises, more participation of citizenry, blah blah blah, you know the drill, like more participation in the process, more rights, the usual suspects. But what he did later is that he kind of maneuvered and in a process we would now call gerrymandering, kind of assured his power. That's kind of a cynical interpretation. The other one is the positive one. Like he was just the fucking angel brought by heaven, Zeus or whatever the fuck, and he just wanted what's best for the common man. C guy was an aristocrat, a very relatively rich aristocrat who had all the power in the world. Those people are rarely those who just give them up. But the story goes that he was just that sweet, right? And the third one is both, essentially. He wanted more. He wanted to give more power to the people, but it kind of got out of hand really fast. And he tried to maintain power by some means, blah blah blah. There is this story that I'm kind of going ahead of myself, but there is this story that one of the things that he made was the ability for the citizenry to vote out the citizen, like in John Wick, excommunicado, like excommunicate him from Athens. Yeah, and the point of that excommunication was essentially that they weren't, they couldn't be considered a citizen anymore. So now we return to the question of what did he create? Like what was created essentially? And here we have a couple of things. The first and probably, like there are two questions here. The first question is who participates? And if we recall at the beginning of our questions about democracy, we have collective and mechanism. This question actually answers the question, like the question about a question about who, the collective question. And in Athenian democracy, the answer was answered essentially in the way that it was, you had to be over age of 18 or so, you had to be male, essentially a man, you couldn't be a slave, so no slave, I guess. And that was essentially it, right? But those are like the formal limitations. The informal limitations were much more pronounced. Essentially, as we have recalled, as we shall see as well, that to be like military service was one, and the other one was the duty to the democracy, essentially, to be an active part of the democratic process. That's like those are the informal ones. And you could lose the ability to be considered a citizen. Like excommunicado was one, but excommunication was one. But you could lose it if you threw your shield in battle, essentially failed to be a good military guy, failed your service to your mother and father, things of that nature, right? There are other things you can do, but these are the, like, if you recall, debt wasn't abolished, so if you fell into debt with the treasury, you could lose your citizenry and things like that, right? There is an exhaustive list from Ober, I think, or somewhere such, Lewis, that made that list. But the two important things are, which I will highlight and explain a bit more, is that the military one and the the duty to your father and mother, essentially, to fail, to be a provider from them in times of need or whatever. The point is that as we in the creation of states, which maybe I do a series on that later on. In Gerda's later work, The Creation of Patriarchy, she postulates that the states were seen as a sort of family, right? As a patriarch is a sort of a ruler over the family, as it was, the states kind of mimicked that sort of authority. So authority of the patriarch kind of is the bedrock for the authority of the government or the ruler. And a failure of, in this case, a man to provide for his family is essentially telling the state that he has failed his duty towards the bedrock of authority of itself. So the protection of family as a unit is and can be seen and often is seen as the failure to respect the authority of the government. The other part about the military service is that the power of the government stems from the power of its military. This is kind of reductionist. It's not only that, right? As we shall see as we go forward in time. But in general, all of the enforcement arm of the government is the police, military, and so on. So the duty of the male man to participate in those mechanisms gives power to the military. Disobedience of that kind is disobedience of the whole process of government. Democracies weren't cured of that. So later on critiques about the power structures from postmodernists, Marxists, whatever, that target these roles cannot be derived down to a simple critique of the mechanization. These have to tackle a much larger institution. The other question is about how the process of democracy actually took place. I'll note this is like dry history. It doesn't really answer many questions, but it does give us a certain indication of how this process was taking place. And the process was taking place essentially. You had like the Bulle, the Council of 500. Each tribe had like 50 democratically elected, quote unquote, like they had their own processes, democratically elected individuals. They get to a council proposes laws go to an assembly is all citizens. They would vote. They kind of convened 40-ish times a year and then made laws. There are other things that kind of happened which limited these things. Like an interesting part is that the council or for the Bulle, the Council of 500, you had to be over 30 years old, you had 1 year service, you had pay, whatever. Like these are kind of interesting notes, but they are inconsequential to the study of authority. What is interesting is that in creation of this male and no slave, you could have a citizen and a non-citizen be married and have a child, and that child could be considered a citizen if the father was a non-citizen. But later on, Pericles, like 30 or so years later, made further limitations on citizenry. So even though this is already a very, very limiting sense of who gets to participate, that was already limited. So when we look about authority here, right, the justification mechanism, we see that the change that brought here is the authority was, quote unquote, at first point, was being shifted from the individual into the collective, which isn't truly the case. The justification mechanism we start to see is being justified not by how power is used, but who uses power. This is a very key distinction. A distinction which now leads us to the next point, the final point, the discontents. And we see, where we will see briefly about the about actually how authority, how people, those in power or those previously in power, utilized the very nature of the change. So the first one is the, I call it discontent, but this could be like a pushback or whatever. And the key point here is Plato, right? With his accusation, mob rule. You can look at it from a purely basic point and say, okay, how decisions are made, and everything he wrote about it being a critique. That's fine. But there is a hidden meaning here. And the meaning is about the nature of authority itself. And that could be viewed from his alternative. Philosopher king, or kings, right? So, when he talked about majority rule, the point wasn't essentially that they can't come to an understanding of the better world, is that they wouldn't come to understanding essentially the proclamations of the philosopher king. They said that those with knowledge, essentially the elite of the intellect, had more chances of creating better ideas than those of the mob. But an interesting point is that Plato never does, at least not very strictly, propose an alternative. He doesn't propose that maybe what we should do is create out of the mob the philosopher king. That is quite an interesting omission. Why not? Why don't we, as later theorists of liberalism has purported, create a sort of educated populace? Why that isn't a choice? There isn't the answer is quite simple, essentially. The problem of mob rule for Plato, at least under this interpretation, and I'm not saying this is a good, best, whatever, it's just one point of one data point, I should say, isn't so much about what. So this is wrong. We can't look at it from this angle. We should actually look at it from another angle. We don't look at what they create. We should look at who creates. So mob rule essentially is a manifestation of the democratic process. So he's saying that the problem isn't that they create, although he says it, but whatever, what they create, although it is a part of the problem, but that they create. What we need is a philosopher king, and that is actually the return to aristocracy. Yeah, so we got the answer to our question about Plato, essentially. The discontent here is that it is essentially asking us, why not turn back the clock and just reject mob democracy and bring back autocracy, essentially, the rule of some people. But this is crucially, why not do that, but instead of hereditary, it is by this idea of knowledge. We can talk very long about knowledge being the, and we need to talk about the authority of expertise quite long here, but we will not. Essentially, what is important for us here, and what will bring us to the authority of the expert quite in the future, is that the question is turning into the authority of the expert, but it is uncanny how often and how directly expertise is seen as the virtue of an individual and not as a virtue of the collective. This is a key point, which will be a a point of concern between much of the later ideologies. But here, the important part is simply that this question has been arisen. Okay, the second part is the rule of maybe we shouldn't call it the rule, but why, or should I say, why isn't it? How did the ruling classes feel about this change? And the answer is that at first they felt that change was bad, that there was a lot of tension, and even more than tension, there was skirmishes, and after the rule of the democracy, we saw the turn back to tyranny, and then again to democracy, and it was a whole history of it all. Just was bloody and cruel and so on and so forth. But the part of it was that as time went on in democracy of the Athenian, the discontent and the anger of the ruling and the moneyed class became lessened. And how did this happen? Because they kind of saw that they already had all the privileges necessary to actually get what they want without actually having to have the monarchy. But with democracy, they also had the shield of the so-called collective will. So the participation was everyone, but not everyone had the privilege of time to educate themselves on the idea, firstly, and secondly, to even participate there. You could come there essentially and be there for 5 minutes or so, and maybe don't even come there and reject your duty because you don't have the time. And what the ruling classes found out, that they could actually pay for the ability to actually educate themselves on rhetoric, or actually buy votes, or do so many different things. To kind of lessen this idea. And another part was that already the wealthy had this kind of semi-cultish following, because at that time the idea of wealth being something very negative wasn't that engaged with reality. You couldn't do much at all, so just you could be jealous and shit like that, and do all these things, but the actual idea of being against the aristocracy was not that developed, I should say. But what was developed is that I have my vote. So what you could do with that vote wasn't the same for aristocratic persons and persons of non-moneyed variety, right? If you had the money, you could your interests were very different than those who didn't have the money. And those who didn't have the money could, and often should, were having had the reasonable idea to sell that vote, because it would impact them more directly to get some money instead of getting, you know, the law in place, which again wouldn't really affect the aristocratic class at all. Maybe it would, but it would be so far away, so abstract, that not many would think of it as a real change. And even if it did, it kind of created this game theory. If I vote this way, you vote this way, and if I vote against the aristocrats, then I would get on the bad side of the aristocrats, and aristocrats have these resources, and they might not hire me, they might blacklist me. You see where this is going, right? And this is what they found out. They really didn't have to have the traditional families, although they, of course, wanted them, because that kind of power is different. But if they thought about it more, then nothing really changed. They already got much of their needs met, but again, power is never content. That is pretty much the nature of it. You need to have a lot of virtue to be content with power. And that's what they did, essentially, is that they had very violent uprisings and tyrannies and whatnot, and the second one is that they just kind of accepted it. Again, the military service part and all these things, if you had money, your life was easier, and the way in which you actually can exercise power is not so much limited by your material conditions. And it is also keen to present that even in the creation of democracy from Solon and Sigai, never was it the case that the material conditions should be changed. Right? They haven't even thought about confiscation of property. That wasn't even an idea. They didn't think about leveling up the field of any kind. Solon did with the debt part, but that is just a small part of it. Really, you get more freedom being free from debt, but the reality which put you in debt is not solved. In many cases, it is extrapolated, and then you get into another debt, and then you are again not citizen. It is really just a vicious circle. So this is, I think this concludes our, I don't want to go too much into depth here. I have been speaking for like 40 minutes already, but I think this is fine for our, if any questions arise, you can ask me in the comments. I guess I'll try to answer. But I tried to summarize this creation as good as I could. But yeah, this is a small introduction in it. In my next video, I will be talking about the trial of Socrates. This is, I think, the most interesting one out of the. It's the second one is interesting. This is less interesting. I don't really think this is interesting, but it is very important for the future developments of democratic thought. The trial of Socrates, I think, is the second most interesting because of its implication about the myth, creation myth of collective will, I should call it, which again goes into the creation of democracy and our current social democratic institutions and thought. And the last one is the creation of anti-democratic ideals, which it's more me kind of a fun little thing. It's not that important. I think it is most important, but it is and it isn't. It is most important for the kind of thought I think is best, but it is least important because anti-authoritative thinking is pretty much dead. There are not really any, or if they exist, they are really just such a minority that most people will never talk to one of those people in their lives who are staunchly and very clearly against all forms of authority. And that idea is the one which we'll be taking in the video after that. But I think this is good for now.